in the late 1990s, what happened was there was a whole question. There was sort of crossroads. Is Russia going to recohere, which it did under Putin, in a very thuggish, brutal way? But again, we go back to how states get recohered. Or was it actually going to begin to start breaking apart into what we think of as a whole collection of new bandit kingdoms? Now, as it was, the state came back. But even so, even today, you can see all kinds of sort of sub-bandit kingdoms within Russia. If you look at Chechnya, it's basically an autonomous bandit kingdom. So it's definitely, as you say, at a different stage.
Now, how much difference is there between a gang and a government? A look through the history of how organised crime has shaped the world suggests they might be more similar than you think. Homo Criminalis, How Crime Organises the World, is the new book by Mark Galeotti, author, historian and honorary professor at the UCL's School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And Mark joins me now. Mark, good morning.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Good to have you back on Times Radio, Mark. Look, your previous books have been all about Russia. What made you write about criminals around the world?
Yeah, well, in part it should be because my surname Galeotti, literally means galley slaves, or nowadays in modern Russian, convicts. So maybe there was an element of predestination. No, look, I've always been interested in this gap between how societies are meant to be organized and how they really are organized. And Russia is a particular laboratory of that, but it's not by any means the only case. So, I've also followed my dubious interests elsewhere.
Well, look, so we have this notion, I think this popular notion that organised crime sort of pretty much started, I don't know, maybe in America in the 1920s, or perhaps imported from Italy a tiny bit earlier. That's not right, is it? What do we know about when organised crime began?
Well, this is the fascinating thing. In some ways, the more organised a society, then the more organised its crime. One is really just the dark shadow of another. So if we go back through history, it is clear that in periods of greater organisation, such as, for example, the high points of the Roman Empire and then the Renaissance in Europe, that also opens up the route to organised crime, whether we're talking about sort of smuggling gangs, whether we're talking about counterfeiters, you name it. So basically, it's whenever we organise ourselves, the gangsters organise too.
You make a fascinating point early on about how we could think of states as well-organised mafias which have been around long enough to accrue legitimacy. Sort of the difference between static bandits and mobile bandits. Explain that to us.
Yeah, this is a notion that a scholar by the name of Mancur Olson came up with, the idea that sort of roving bandits essentially come in, steal everything, kill anyone they want, and then head off. A stationary bandit realizes that if you basically steal everything, then there's nothing to steal tomorrow. So they just steal enough, and they encourage the people under their control to produce more, so that there's going to be more to steal tomorrow. And look, it's a little polemical to draw the direct comparison between modern states and organized crime. But if you look at how states get built, and this is a process that we're still seeing in parts of, particularly the global south these days, but where do states come from? It's not actually as if all of a sudden people think, I'll tell you what, let's have a government and let's have a king or whatever. It basically comes from people who can come along, extort enough, but not too much, provide a degree of protection, and then come up with nice myths as to why it's okay and why you should be obeying them anyway. It's not just because you're afraid they're going to cut your head off. That is really how states begin to emerge.
Yeah, not that different necessarily from. Going back to Russia then, in that case, could we, in some sense, then sort of see Russia as being just a different stage at that evolution from crime gang to government?
There is an element of that, and it's fascinating because, look, in the 1990s, Russia more or less, didn't collapse, but it was certainly sort of on that route, and that's when people are desperately looking for new pseudo-states. And I talk in the book about how the smarter gangsters began to realize that instead of just trying to steal everything, offering protection, resolving contract disputes, doing all these kind of boring things that states provide, actually it can be very lucrative and can get you control over a turf. And so one could say that, in fact, in the late 1990s, what happened was there was a whole question. There was sort of crossroads. Is Russia going to recohere, which it did under Putin, in a very thuggish, brutal way? But again, we go back to how states get recohered. Or was it actually going to begin to start breaking apart into what we think of as a whole collection of new bandit kingdoms? Now, as it was, the state came back. But even so, even today, you can see all kinds of sort of sub-bandit kingdoms within Russia. If you look at Chechnya, it's basically an autonomous bandit kingdom. So it's definitely, as you say, at a different stage.
I mean, turning to this country, most people here don't experience organised crime or aren't really aware of it outside TV dramas, or so we think. How much organised crime is there in Britain?
I mean, there is a lot. Look, it ranges from, to follow on from the news story, I mean, the degree to which pressure on the health service, on housing and so forth is driven by people smuggling and people trafficking. But there's also, look, you go to a car boot sale and you buy some cheap goods that you think, oh, that's a nice bargain. You may well be buying the produce of organised theft rings or indeed organised counterfeit smuggling. To a degree, our whole financial systems are still based on dirty money that has been laundered and relaundered to the point where it's now essentially impossible to tell good money from bad. I mean, I think, again, we tend to kind of have this comforting, cozy notion that exactly organized crime is mafiosi with Tommy guns who are going to, come along and offer you prohibited hooch or drugs. And that as long as we're not dealing with that, then it's nothing to do with us. But in fact, so much of our societies have found ways of coexisting with and even building off the proceeds of organised crime. And that's something we tend to close our eyes to.
You've got some amazing stories in the book about the sort of the extremes to which organised crime has gone to. I think my favourite has got to be the sort of drug smuggling cartels submarine. Tell us about that and tell us about some of your favourites.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it was this sort of fascinating case whereby at first you had, again, 1990s collapse of the Soviet Union. Pretty much everything was for sale in Russia, and a gang of particularly bizarre, picaresque sort of ne'er-do-wells thought, why don't we broker a deal to buy a submarine from Russia that Latin American drug cartels used to smuggle cocaine to you? That fell to pieces, but the idea had sort of created a notion. And they started to build their own semi-submersibles, including the Shay, which did the whole epic all the way to the coast of Spain, with people basically using a plastic bag as a toilet and living off fiber bars, basically. But nonetheless, they made it there. And unfortunately, then, right at the last minute, they couldn't rendezvous with the boat that was meant to take the cocaine off them. And they ended up just simply having to beach their boat. But the point is that, look, this boat had taken about $1 million to build. It was carrying over $100 million worth of cocaine. I mean, this is it. The economics are inescapable. And this is why we have a whole bunch of these other sort of handmade artisanal semi-submersibles plying their way through the Caribbean and even sometimes across the oceans in order to sort of satisfy this constant demand for drugs. But I think this is the idea that, as long as there is a market, there will always be a supply, is, I think, one of the sort of fundamental themes of the book. And as I say, it goes back to all societies. I mean, I do like the idea of Aztec cocoa bean counterfeiting. I mean, to the Aztecs, the cocoa bean was not just a source of this ritual liquid. I mean, it wasn't like our hot chocolate today. It was a much, much more bitter and rather unpleasant concoction, having tasted it. But it was also, the cocoa bean was their money, their currency. And so, obviously, people began to counterfeit it with all kinds of things, bits of avocado pith or whatever, but even dried dung. Now, the problem was that most of the time, this cocoa is trading hands just simply as currency, but sometimes people are going to make a drink out of it. At the point at which they start using dried dung to make a drink, even they are going to know that they have been sold a pup. So, given that the Aztecs are known for not being particularly into rehabilitating offenders, but rather sort of just working out different and ingenious ways of killing people, instead they had to essentially launder the cocoa beans, make sure that their counterfeit was then inserted into the legitimate economy in distant cities by itinerant traders, just simply that it didn't tip off the authorities of quite where they were being made. So again, going back to this notion, yes, this is nothing new.
But it's also, I mean, you make this great point that it's sort of like, should we think about crime differently then? Because you do make the point, or at least the point comes through, that it's rational. Both these things are rational ways to act. We think of crime as being a moral failing, and of course it is. But these are people in societies who are seeing opportunities, following those opportunities in manners that simply happen to be illegal. Should that change how we think of crime and criminals?
I mean, I think it should, not because we should therefore accept it and say that these criminals, they're just simply misunderstood entrepreneurs. But instead, we have to realize that where does crime, above all organized crime, flourish? It's in vacuums. It's in the vacuum, as I say, between how a state is meant to work and how it really works, but also in the gap between the moral economy of the state, in other words, what the state says is right and wrong, and what people, or at least large communities of people, think is acceptable. Look, we all commit crimes. If any of your listeners have never ever broken a speeding limit, or perhaps sort of included some slightly questionable expense on their tax return or whatever, then good for them, but I'd be fairly amazed. The point is, though, there are certain crimes that we think are kind of acceptable up to a point. There are certain crimes that we think, well, the state shouldn't be stopping me from, whether it's watching pornography or whether it's smoking cannabis or whatever else. And it's in that clash between different cultures, really, that organized crime flourishes. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that we always have to give way, but it's that we have to recognize that really, if you're going to fight organized crime, yes, of course, you need policing and prisons and all that kind of stuff. But essentially, you have to deal with the market. You have to deal with the demand rather than, as we almost invariably do, look at the supply instead and think we can somehow strangle it even while people want to spend money on it.
Look, finally, Mark, and briefly, because we're nearly out of time, but I'm interested in your perspective on how on the internet and crime, because it's often struck me that a lot of the sort of the internet giants of today, they began basically pretty much by breaking the law. But PayPal played fast and loose with banking regulations. Facebook played fast and loose with data. Is that are we seeing basically the same thing, that you have sort of intensely powerful organisations that frankly behave in a sort of really a criminal manner until the law decides it's not criminal anymore? And that's much the same as a lot of the things you're talking about.
Yeah, I would like to reassure my learned friends that I'm not in any way drawing direct parallels between PayPal, Facebook, and organised crime.
Nor me, absolutely, yes.
Exactly. But I think what it speaks to is exactly, first of all, that this is a period in which, they were essentially operating within this, not just legal, but also moral vacuum. No one really had a sense of what was right and what was wrong, and therefore they're always defining it themselves for their own convenience. But also, it speaks to a wider issue that we've also seen already with, for example, finance and such like, is that increasingly laws are national, economies are global. And, the internet giants are just simply the most extreme of the various agencies that can take fullest advantage of that, whether it's in terms of evading tax or whether it's in terms of just getting their way around inconvenient laws. And there's really not a lot at the moment that individual states confined to their own borders, can do about it.
Cheery. Well, look, the book is Homo Criminalis, How Crime Organises the World, and it's by Mark Galeotti. Mark, thank you very much indeed.